begin?
Yes.
All right. So again, just sort of grounding and acknowledging the Indigenous people who have cared for the land that we have the privilege of living on for many, many generations, and may their wisdom be held in our hearts as we move forward into this work of changing communities. So what I'd love to do, because this is all about evaluating impact, is really take some time to unpack terms that often get mushed together, which add an unnecessary layer of complexity to this. So really distinguishing between data, shared measures, and shared measurement. And then really highlight that there's a very real tension that exists between using data to track progress and evaluate or hold groups accountable for progress, and using data and measurement for learning. And so, you know, navigating that can be interesting, and it's important to know a little bit about that. As I said at the outset, I really am keen to share with you results from a recent data walk that we held virtually for 2 groups, and it seemed to work really well. And they were doing it early in their journey as a way of engaging others and raising awareness in their community. And then the tool that I really want to profile for you all, which is so simple and yet requires commitment, is called the Outcome Diary tool, designed to help you engage your partners in regularly tracking and sharing impact over time. All right, so as we have sort of made our way through each of these 5 practices, what we've learned over time at Tamarack is that evaluating impact is actually the most essential of the 5 practices, because it does 2 things. It helps you to powerfully tell the story of the impact that you are having through your work, which is critical for sustaining the work, but it also brings that lens of experimentation and learning from innovation forward, and reminds us that the data is what informs where we put our energy and gives us permission to experiment, right? As long as we are committed to learning from those experiments and investing in the ones that generate the results we're looking for. I love this as a formula for achieving impact. So if you grow community awareness, will, and action, and you combine that with efforts to shift systems and policies, and through this work, programs and project interventions become increasingly aligned, what you will end up with in the longer term is targeted population level outcomes. And the question that is always should be top of mind in your collaborative work is, what are the critical shifts, system shifts, that we want to really focus our energy and attention on as to how we're going to achieve our common agenda. And so they could be, as I said, shifts in systems, but it could also be shifts in human experience to create the kind of effort that you want, that you know is needed for getting the results that you are driving for. So in the work of collective impact, shared measurement is one of the 5 conditions, and it really has 3 elements to it. The first is that it gets you to identify key measures that the group agrees you are going to track over time to assess and demonstrate your progress as a collaborative on your common agenda. So really key that you don't go wide and broad necessarily, always looking at what data do we have. You really should have some rough sense about what your common agenda is as a collaborative before you then use that to help narrow in and focus and evaluate potential measures. Second, it's also not just about identifying those measures, but making sure that across your collaborative effort, there's a mechanism or systems in place for regularly gathering and compiling and analyzing those measures. And the most important piece is, how do you design into the work of your collaborative opportunities to periodically come back and look at the data and interpret, what does it mean? What is that now telling you about that can inform your work that you can use to adapt your strategy. Here's a great example. Comes from a very mature collective impact effort in Ontario, just outside Toronto, and they are region-wide. And as you can see, the focus of this collaborative network that has 6 anchor partners, which are the Catholic School Board, the Public School Board, the Children's Developmental Services Agency, Public Health, and the police, I think, and the Regional Community Services. Those are the anchor partners, and they have lots of community partners as well. But what they started at the very beginning is their goal as a regional network and collaborative is to ensure that every child in their region thrives. They then ask themselves, what are the measures? How would we know? For children to be thriving, what do we know about what they need? And they came up with what they refer to as the Halton 7, which are the 7 critical outcomes that children would need to meet to be able to give them collectively a sense that they were positioned to thrive, right? So they're healthy, they're learning, they're positively connected, they're safe, the families in the community are strong and stable, schools are connected to the community, and there's robust neighborhoods where people can live, work, and play. And then once they got clear on that, they moved back a new level and said, okay, if those are the critical aspects of what we need to pay attention to achieve our common agenda of every child thriving, then what data is available and or what data will we track to help us inform and keep a pulse on those 7 elements. And then they also kind of started to zero in on what programs, doing some mapping in the community, what programs do exist and what other programs need to be introduced throughout the system to build this collective commitment around all children thriving. Really like how they've done it. They've also done this really later on as they've evolved their work. They actually created a shared data portal which you can go into and visit. It's an interactive online database which is open to the entire community service providers. It offers key demographic data. It also layers on some of the research data that they've been doing. And in particular, they've been working with the Search Institute's Developmental Assets Framework as part of what they've been tracking. And so you can actually go in and put in geographic kind of boundaries, and it will spit out data for you and let you see it visually in terms of how it compares to the region overall. It's really cool. They've also been really good about being transparent and sharing how they've navigated people's data sharing restrictions and that kind of thing. So the policies that they had to put in place to have this work. But it's a robust and vibrant sort of portal that everybody uses. Okay, so let's take a look and distinguish between these 3 interrelated things. So we have evaluation, which is a whole range of activities that we would use that allow us to collect information about the outcomes of our collaborative work. The shared measures are the common indicators that we've committed to tracking that are linked to the common agenda that we're advancing together. And the shared measurement systems are that broader infrastructure that we've created to ensure that the data that we are committed to measuring does get measured, and that there are opportunities for folks in the community to come together and make sense about what they need. So shared measurement systems are both an input to evaluation, and also they can be an object of the evaluation as well. So, some wisdom. It's really important that you understand the interconnection but distinction of those 3 terms. So be clear about what the outcomes are that your collaborative project is focusing on, and then be really selective about which measures should be shared. So, there's all kinds of filters that you have to think about in terms of reliability of the data. Are you zeroing in on indicators that are within your sphere of influence to impact? And are they, at a localized enough level? and be hyper-selective about what you want to measure together as it relates to your common agenda. So this is critical when you're kind of thinking about shared measurement. You want to design what you think. You want to be tracking. You want to develop the systems you need to both collect and then analyze that data. And then you want to deploy that system and track it and tweak it over time. So 3 chunks of work go into building this shared measurement dimension. So here's some typical challenges that folks run into when coming to agreement, excuse me, as a collaborative. So sometimes you have difficulty coming to agreement on common outcomes and indicators. You know, sometimes, and this speaks to that tension between accountability and learning, is sometimes people are cautious to share the data that they have because they're afraid that that data will be used to judge them as being less than, less effective, whatever. People just generally have limited capacity for measurement and data collection. So a lot of the successful collaboratives that I know, actually, when they get to the phase where they've got their common agenda and their priority areas of focus kind of roughly articulated, that might be a time when you want to bring in the local community data geeks, right? And get them to sit down and say, if this is our common agenda and these are the priority areas we're wanting to focus our work, what data currently exists that could really help us track this over time? One of the other challenges that is often common is that you get funding from multiple sources and that your funders may require you to be collecting certain pieces of data for the purposes of reporting to them. And then, you know, on top of that, you know, you're thinking as a collaborative, there are other measures that you might want to be tracking. And so the trick is to sort of, you know, not end up having to have these multiple sets of indicators you're tracking for different players and asking and thinking about to what extent they could be aligned. And then it's you know, purely an investment of time and money to both develop and maintain both the human and technological supports you might need for a robust system. You know, interestingly, that Halton Our Kids Network group, as their work has continued to evolve, one of the pieces that they have seen and taken on as a role is actually collecting data on the well-being of children in their region and then taking it out and sharing it with community-based groups to help them build their own skill and capacity about understanding data, how it works, and how it might be used to inform that each agency's strategy, programs, and thinking. So just something to think about. That might be part of what is your mission and mandate. So I really like this piece a lot. It starts by saying, you know, when you sit down to evaluate a collaborative effort, there's 4 broad buckets of things potentially you could be evaluating and measuring over time. So one is measuring the effectiveness of the collective initiative itself. So to what extent are you incorporating all 5 conditions of collective impact? To what extent would you say there's trust and shared commitment across the collaborative? You know, is there a real culture of learning? Is there diversity? There's lots of assessments actually about the robustness of a collaborative effort, and that might be a dimension of what you are looking at and studying. You can evaluate the systems that are being targeted by your initiative. So you might want to be tracking, for example, how people in the system are now behaving differently as a result of your work, how funding may be flowing in new directions or being reallocated in different ways, what, you know, the number of policy changes that are linked to the work that you're doing, and cultural norms. And this for me is attitudes, right? How are people's attitudes and beliefs being questioned or challenged or changed as a result of the work that you're doing in your community? You can also be tracking the outcomes that your collective impact initiative is contributing to achieving. These are population level and or could speak to your community's capacity to come together and tackle tough problems or to innovate. These ones tend to be later stage because these show up later. Like if you think about, you know, your ripple of work, it can take up to 4 to 5 years to see those population level indicators start to shift. And then lastly, one of the important things you want to be tracking and or thinking about when you go back and you review the data and hope to make sense of it is how is the reality of your community shifting and changing, and how might that affect the results that you're seeing. So certainly, great example would be the impact of COVID, right? That's had a huge cascading effect on a whole ton of things. And so how do we take that into account as we're assessing the work? Make sense? Okay, I love this. This comes from the work of FSG. They actually have a 3-part guide, which I would really encourage, talking about evaluating collective impact work. And what I really like is they acknowledge that what you're measuring in the early stages of your work is really more process stuff. You know, how many meetings have you had? You know, what level of trust exists? How much collaboration is showing up? How clear is your group about its theory of change? That kind of stuff. It isn't until the middle years of your work that you really start to see systems and behavior change outcomes and indicators, and then ultimately those population level ones come much later. So, you know, you may be evaluating different things at different times, and I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. We've created a tool at Tamarack that really kind of looks at the phases of maturity of a collective impact effort, and it's rooted in some research that FSG has done, saying that there are 4 basically pillars of success that are always at play when you're designing and implementing a collaborative project, but the nature of what you're focused on in each of those pillars shifts and changes over time. So depending on how mature your effort is in the work that you're doing. And I see your question, Monica, about is there an article that talks about 4 to 5 years to reach population level indicators? I think it can be even more varied than that. So I think thinking about how you measure milestones of progress on the journey to outcomes, population outcomes, is really, really important. The other thing I would say, if we go back one step, is that 3-part guide on evaluating collective impact efforts. The 3rd guide actually has sample indicators, which I think is a really interesting thing to take a look at, because if you think about the maturity of your initiative, what are some of the things you ought to be tracking? That might give you kind of a quick start of thinking about, oh, we could be measuring this, or we should be tracking that as a milestone indicator on the way to the broader change. So really, we've kind of unpacked this a little bit, but we're saying of the 4 pillars, evaluation, improvement, and learning is one for sure. And the focus is on really making sure there's alignment across your collaborative on what it is you're using to track your progress over time, and what data you're going to monitor to help you do that, and how are you going to do that sense making that we talked about. And then you'll see there's key questions and there's success indicators that you want to be thinking about to help you see whether you're on track. Okay, so we talked a little bit about really, this is one of these tensions that you're always navigating when you step into the realm of evaluating the impact of your work. And that's that tension between accountability, whether it's accountability to your board, to your community, whether it's accountability to a funder, and using data and evaluation as a learning mechanism for yourselves, because you're experimenting in your collaborative. So, you know, each one has a very positive and beneficial side that's contributing. So on the accountability side, you know, the questions you're really focusing on: did we implement our work as we planned it? Did we meet quality and or ethical standards? Did we make progress on our desired results? But there's a dark side to the accountability piece. One is, you know, inappropriate expectations. These aren't necessarily metrics that, like, we may be tracking these metrics for an external validation source, not necessarily because we use them well to inform our work. You know, if we don't meet the targets, do we end up, you know, getting to a place of blame? That's often why some people are loath to share data because they're afraid it will be used in that way. And then there's always the tension and challenge, right, of gaming behaviors. And I've got this funny law that someone shared with me. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. Because what happens is we focus on making that target and looking good for the target and losing focus on the real purpose behind the target, right? Because we're all so good at working to goals, and it can be a bit rigid when the work that we're doing in community is still emergent. We could end up having tied ourselves to measures that in fact don't accurately reflect what we're actually seeing and what we're actually doing. And so there's tension there. On the learning side, if we're tracking data for our own ongoing adaptation, what we're really focusing on is what are we learning about this challenge and how to address it? What is working and not working for whom? And what do we think about how and why that is? We're asking questions about what's in our sphere of influence and what isn't. And what's happening within the system, because it's not staying static either. And how do we represent that? The challenge and the dark side of the learning piece is that people are loosely committed or have, as a collaborative, you might have different commitments around what you want to learn. You know, you could have drift where you're kind of losing your focus. You have insufficient expectations, weak momentum, and this real loss of a sense of agency. We're looking at this data, we're feeling overwhelmed, and we're thinking, holy camoli, you know, it's not our job to change this whole mess, right? So those are the tensions that exist. It's not perfect, but it's there. So the challenge for us then is how do we find the right balance between accountability and learning? And what does that look like to you in the context of the work you're trying to do? Wanted to offer you some really interesting examples because a lot of that, we've been talking a lot about the importance of systems change, not just about programmatic change or changes for individuals. And so this comes from the work of the Vancouver Community Foundation. And so they're starting to reimagine the outcomes that they're driving for, and they're imagining them, as you can see, on 3 orders, right? So the first is we are seeing increased knowledge and capacity within system actors, improved relationships, new practices, new tools, new approaches. That's a level of outcome that's really critical, and it actually helps to drive toward the second order of outcomes, which is you're seeing improved practices within the system and improved policies within systems that affect the issue that we care about. And then flowing out from there, much more long-term, is when we would start to see new narratives and or new attitudes and cultural shifts around the issue and or population level impact and or social transformation around how the issue is recognized and addressed and taken care of. So interesting, one really interesting way of really starting to capture and more accurately reflect the nature of work that's unfolding. Here's another one. So Healthier Together is a really interesting initiative of the Palm Health Foundation. They're in year 6. They picked 6 communities within Palm Beach County that were showing huge disparities in health equity, and decided as a foundation to totally experiment with a whole new way of partnering with resident leaders in those 6 communities to focus on making lasting change around social determinants of health. It's a really great read. The link to the paper is in the bottom. And the reason it's a great read is that they're really passionate and clear about how challenging this was for them, because they had a board that they were accountable to, and they had made a significant investment in this, and the work didn't look anything like what they imagined it might at the beginning, but they were so determined and committed to work in partnership and be able to be adaptive and emergent to the needs of community, but they were struggling to come up with a way of evaluating and measuring that over time. And so what they've shared more recently, after kind of beating their heads up for a while and letting go of the traditional ways that they had been tracking their progress beforehand, because those they felt were limited and they were driven by some assumptions from the funder about what was needed, they started to look instead for what they called readiness signals and different types of wins in the nature of the work. So they've actually unpacked quite a bit more deeply kind of what goes into a readiness signal in the community. If they're seeing a certain number of these behaviors and or actions in the community, that gives them a sense that there's growing readiness for community action. Then there's signals of growth, and then there's signals of transformation, and they kind of mapped those all out. And they look at and track 3 different kinds of wins. So outcome wins, so things that have led to real improvements in the lives of people in the community. Who's better off? Insight wins, which are learning. So they're saying, like, if we've learned something really big, and it can even come from a failure, then that is a different type of win, but it's an equally valid win to track and acknowledge. And then the last one is, as you see at the bottom, their capability wins. So they're seeing new behaviors, new skills, new capacities emerging in individuals and groups in the community. And that's now the frame that they're starting to use to track their progress over time. And here's another one. I'm really excited about this one. This comes from the work that's being championed by Centrale de Grand Montréal, which is the United Way, actually, of Greater Montreal. And what's unique about this collective impact project is that they actually have pooled the resources and commitments of 9 different funders across the entire community, as well as 3 strategic partners, the Coalition of Neighborhood Roundtables, their public health, and their city. And Centrale plays like this project management role, but they had, through those 9 funders, created a $23 million accelerator fund, is what they call it, that they said they would commit to this neighborhood work for a minimum of 6 years. Of the 30 neighborhoods in Montreal, 17 of them are involved in this project, and the overarching goal of these neighborhood-based projects is poverty reduction, which I think is really fascinating, but they come with this understanding that what poverty alleviation might look like at a neighborhood level could look very different, and that's okay. So, you know, they're tracking stuff like the success of young people, access to affordable, healthy food, community infrastructure and equipment, but a higher, greater inclusion of vulnerable people, and more adequate housing. So they're looking at poverty very holistically, and they're tracking a range of improvements at these 17 neighborhood levels based on a grassroots, bottom-up kind of articulation within those communities of what it is that matters to that community and what that community wants to focus on, and then tracking those and aggregating those results over time. So again, they're about 5-6 years in, fun to watch how it's taking shape, and the diversity of initiatives that are starting to now cultivate and emerge from the communities as part of this overarching citywide poverty reduction effort. Okay, so I'm going to pause it right there. What do you think? Any comments or questions so far about any of this?
This is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I was writing down. Hi. I really like what you said about essentially like when a measure that you've picked becomes just a target. And you were saying it kind of ceases to be like its own. I forget what you were saying in the second.
Yeah, it's called Goodhart's Law. I'll send it to you. It's called Goodhart's Law, and it says when a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure, because people aren't paying attention to the root cause. They're just focused on meeting the measure, right?
Yeah.
So if you measure people on the number of nails that they make, then you might get thousands of tiny nails, right? If you measure people on the weight that the nails are made, you'll get like 5 really huge nails, right? So it's a really important reminder about being intentional about what it is we want to incentivize people around. And it also reminds me of a comment that my colleague Mark Cabage always says, and he's one of the best developmental evaluators I know. He says, no data without story, no story without data. And so, because a lot of data needs context, right? Yeah. And so it's so important that we have both the actual measurable data so we can track our progress over time, but we also need the story behind it.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really timely. I know a lot of us in the fields of like early intervention and early childhood, what we're noticing is that fewer families are signing up for services that have historically been very popular, right? And so we're just kind of asking the why. And, you know, I think we're still figuring that out, but it has a lot to do with COVID and how stressed families are and stuff. But it kind of, to your point, like if the measure that everyone cares about is like how many families are enrolled in your program, but you're missing the greater issue, which is that like you're still getting the same number of referrals, maybe even more, but each referral is less likely to result in a family actually enrolling because they have these significant other stressors. If that's true, then you have to change and shift your programming to try to meet what those other stressors are if you want to continue to be sustainable in the work.
Yeah, I really value that story because it reminds me of doing a workshop on principles-focused evaluation. So it was really about, you know, if we're doing a lot of social change, sometimes it's about driven by values and principles. And so how do you turn a principle into a measure, right? It's sort of, it's a new and emerging approach to evaluation. But one of the stories that was illustrated in the workshop talked about the incredible progress that this young man had made from being a teen dad, dropped out of school, incarcerated, but then, you know, getting out, reconnecting with his son, you know, finishing his GED, moving into employment. Because, and one of the things that they noticed through the evaluation is one of the reasons for that was the long-term consistent relationship that the agency had really embedded as a principle in how they worked with these young people over time. But because the funder's metric was, did he have his own home? Because he was homeless at one point, and that's how he came to be referred to them. He'd made all these incredible, huge leaps and positive progress pieces to demonstrate his movement forward. But since the only metric being counted was, did he have his own home, he was seen as a failure. Mm-hmm. So I think that says to me, it's really interesting. Yes, we need to evaluate, and we need to be asking ourselves, are we evaluating the right stuff? And or are we looking at, and how are we reporting out, not just the data, but also what the data means?
And sometimes I would just say that sometimes those target measures are what qualify people to be eligible for the program in the first place. So, you know, if that's the case, then like you were giving the example of the man and his housing status, like if it was important or a necessary qualifier for him to be in some kind of program based on his housing status, but that he wasn't meeting that criteria, then he might not be eligible for other types of supports.
So they've unintentionally created it as an incentive to stay homeless, potentially, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Or go to some other kind of.
would he lose that? Would he lose access to those critical supports from that agency if his status changed?
Yeah, like at at our Homeward House collaborative, one of our examples is that we had a father who was trying to regain custody of his child, but he needed housing in order to have the child placed back with him, but he couldn't get into short-term housing without a child placed with him, right? So he was in this dilemma. But it was because our partners were able to recognize that dilemma and work around it, that he was able to be housed safely, and then she was able to be placed with him. So, I mean, the upshot is identify these problems and get around them if there's understanding as to why it's a barrier.
I think for me, what you've just shared is the most beautiful example of why we need systems change, right? Not just programmatic solutions. Because as you say, these organizational rules that have been established and create limits on what people think is possible, limits them from being able to do the kind of work that needs to be done to meet exceptional circumstances, right?
Right.
And eliminating those barriers and including more alignment across the different players in the system and building enough trust between and amongst these players to change their rules and allow people to sometimes color outside the lines is part of what this work should be about, really.
Yeah. I can think of another example that is a current problem for our early childhood learning program called ECAP in our state. It's basically like Head Start, but it's run by Washington State. And so the criteria for being able to enroll is we use our federal poverty level. And unfortunately, even though the ECAP program that I work with was placed in what's known to be a community with a lot of low income, the families, as they're applying and they're giving us their paperwork and their pay stubs and all the things, are turning out to be too high. Like their income level, it places them too high to enroll their children in the program. But nobody would ever say, oh, this is a really well-off family. Or, they're trying to get around it. They are very low income, but they may be stringing together 3 different jobs to pay for housing because the price of housing and basic needs are high in our county. So they're really in that same dilemma of like they earn a little bit too much to qualify for this program that is it's established to help families move out of poverty and create more stability for their children's development. That's the essence of the program. But they're not able to qualify families who truly need it because of this particular measure that is really impractical.
You put your finger right on another system shift that needs to happen. And I know I'm really keen to show you this data walk example because it focuses on the issue of poverty in the case of this group. And one of their data stations was actually something called the cliff effect, they called it. And so what happens is these individualized programs have different restrictions. And so what happens is those critical supports get pulled away as someone is progressing as hoped on the pathway to prosperity, and this unintentionally punishes them, right, for doing exactly what we say we're going to. And so it needs the broader will then of a whole host of people and a very clear system change strategy around how you would work around that. Because you're right, trying to handle it individual family by individual family isn't going to get you there. So you want to, can I share this example of the data walk? Because I think that this might be a really interesting thing. You could imagine, given the examples that you were sharing, imagine if you invited, government, state and municipal and national staff, government officials who administer some of these programs on a data walk hosted by the people in your community, right? Talking about this and what could happen. That would be a really interesting thing to look at. So here, I shamelessly plagiarized the notion of a data walk from a really good resource created by the Urban Institute. So you can access that if you want to learn more about the process and the different ways people play with it. But basically, for the purposes of the work I was doing with this community, it was really to give an opportunity to deepen understanding around the factors that affect and contribute to poverty in their region, to invite a range of diverse community leaders to share their ideas and insights and think about how they might contribute to reducing poverty across their region, and to really emphasize why a collective approach was needed. So what we did was we worked in advance with the host of the event to find and create the 6 data stations that are profiled. Now, there's some work that needs to be done, right, around zeroing in. You're not trying necessarily to be representative of all the information and knowledge you have about the issue of poverty. You want to strategically cherry pick data points that are going to highlight priority areas that your group has already begun to think might be important areas for you to focus on in your collaborative work. So what you do is you put together a small group of 6 to 8 people. Optimally, what you're looking for is you want to make sure that you have as mixed a group as possible in each of the small groups. So, you know, maybe a local business leader together with a funder, together with someone working in community services, together with 2 or 3 people that have experienced what it is to be poor in this community, because that's where you're going to see some rich conversation and people's assumptions being challenged. And that's ultimately what you want. And so you kind of coach people around, yes, there will be a small group facilitator and, you know, scribe or whatever, but it's everybody's job, because you'll only have like 6 to 8 minutes per station to make sure that different people's ideas, curiosity is explored, and to pay attention to people whose ideas are very different from yours. And it's not necessarily about moving to agreement, but curiosity about why their perspective may be very different from your own. So just to give you a quick look, what they did, they had 6 stations. So the first was who is poor in their region, and there's always a thought-provoking question with each data station. So how might poverty impact the sustainability and viability of our region? Was the question that they picked. The second one showed poverty rates for young adults. So they compared young people across the U.S., young people within their state, and young people within their region. How might our community support young people in poverty to move towards sustainability? Great question. Third one really looked at the issue of how poverty is distributed by race in their community. And it says, how does the issue of race affect the design of any poverty reduction effort we might want to make? They've got one on young families. They've got one on poverty and homeownership. And this is the cliff effect one. So Sarah, this is what they tried to show, right? I thought this was powerful. Only 4 people born into poverty will rise out of it permanently. And that's national data. And so what they're saying is, look, there are 3 main income support or support programs for people on low income. And then look what happens when your income nudges just above, suddenly, boom, you lose this one. And then you sink worse off than you were before. If you get to that point again, then you lose another round of your supports, and look at how you plummet, right? So it's really about how might a regional poverty reduction strategy address both the long-term and generational impacts of poverty, was the question that they asked. So you give the small groups about 8 minutes to walk around to each station. And then what we did was we used Mural to allow people to catch at each one of the stations what their initial reactions were and what their thoughts and ideas were to that thought-provoking question on the screen. And so they walked through every one of those stations and they caught people's ideas. And then what we did was we gave them 20 minutes at the end, anchored them back in the goal and objective of the region's poverty reduction work, and asked them to identify possible barriers and or opportunities or enablers that might help this group to achieve the goals that they'd established for themselves. We asked them to think about, you know, the unusual partners parents, youth, families, organizations, and sectors other than the nonprofit sector who might be able to contribute in some way to this effort and to capture those ideas as well. So there you go. There's an example of sort of taking data in the moment and using it as a way of illustrating for folks the issues and letting them climb in and think about how that could work. And because we did it with Mural, you could kind of catch and everyone could see those thoughts, and then we had each one of the groups report out before they went back in and did that sense-making piece. Any thoughts or ideas about this? Getting the right thought-provoking question, I think, is always interesting. I've done a couple of these data walks now, and I would say another challenge is you might be looking for certain types of data, and that data may not be available. But then I've also seen a group that did something really powerful where they actually got quotes from users and put them all in a big cluster, right, with themes on them. And that was the data station, which shows you you can actually use qualitative data as well.
How many people can you have viewing or doing the walk, you know, to see it at a time? Is that something that's got a limitation on it?
No. So I've done it with about 80 people in real life. And so what we did in that situation was we set up 2 identical walkabouts. Mm-hmm. So you had this, like if there were 8 stations or 5 stations or something, then you had 2 groups really at each one of the stations, and then they rotated all the way around. So that's one way that you're doing it if you're doing it live. In the virtual ones that we just did, we had between 70 and 80 people per walk. And so really the challenge was more about as people RSVP'd and they got a sense of how many people were coming, the host had to do a bit of work to propose composition for the small groups to make sure that they were pretty diverse and that we had a small group facilitator and scribe for each of the groups. And if we're thinking, like if they had 80 people, you wouldn't want more than 8 people in a group, right? So then you have 10 identical groups, and we just had 10 murals. And each group had its own mural. And then each one of the murals could be printed off and shared afterward. So you could probably run as many as you wanted once you got clear on what the data was.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, well, I have a tool for you, which is different than the data walk, but I do want to walk through it because I think it might be a useful thing for you to think about as you start trying to think about putting evaluation and measurement into your collaborative work. It's called the Outcome Diary tool. And what you do is you decide for your collaborative what are the critical outcomes that you wanted to be tracking. So in this case, this group decided benefits or changes for individuals or populations. Then it could be changes in attitude, changes in capacity, knowledge, could be policy changes. And so once you have some high-level agreement on the nature of changes you want to be tracking as a result of your collaborative work, then it's about the discipline of sending out an email to all the collaborative partners on a regular basis and hounding them and making sure that they appreciate how critical it is to get data back to you. And then one person could even track it in an Excel spreadsheet. And then at the end of 6 months, print back a report to share with your collaboratives on the number of different types of changes that your collaborative has been responsible for. And the reason why something like this, while simple, is important is particularly when you're working as a collaborative group and there's so many diverse organizations involved, being able to track stuff over time and develop an easy but consistent way of tracking that progress as a practice becomes really important. So in this case, what they do is they decided that they were a poverty reduction effort, and they decided that they wanted to track outcomes or impacts in 3 broad areas. The first is impacts on individuals and households. The second is impacts on the community's knowledge and capacity. The third is impacts on policy change. And then they ask monthly for the various partners in their collaboration.
Sylvia, I think we lost your sound. I don't know if you can hear me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, so what they do is that they ask each partner, write your name down. What activity have you undertaken in the last month? What is the outcome of that activity? And what contribution would you say that our collaborative has made to enable that activity and outcome to be possible? Right, so the city said, well, we just changed our policy around rental subsidies, and it will provide a $4 million benefit over 5 years that'll benefit 400 families a year. And the contribution that this collaborative made was that they made a presentation to City Council to support the decision, and that the city is a partner in the collaborative, and that's raised their awareness and understanding about the issue. You know, similarly, school board invited a person with the lived experience of poverty to speak to staff about the impact of poverty. It resulted in a second workshop for community members that drew 300 people. And, you know, here's the contribution we give to the collaborative for helping to make that possible. So, you know, each one of these in some ways seems small, and you won't always get something from everybody every month, but it's a way of simply tracking different types of impact in a way that you can start to notice patterns and aggregate impact up over time. Make sense? You know, for this to work though, all partners have to be really committed to understanding what you're looking for and reporting back. And then it's also equally important that whoever the holder is of that data create a regular moments to report back on what's being seen in that reporting and how your collective impact is growing over time. So, I mean, a thought for you might be, if you were going to do an outcome diary, what kinds of impacts would you want to be tracking? And what, you know, even if you went back retrospectively 6 months, what are some of the things that you might be able to note there? So there you go. Just a thing to think about how to translate this into really practical, easy ways to put it into action. So we're wrapping up. Can you believe it? We've come to the end of an hour. We have one more deep dive session, which will really give you some time maybe to think about both the innovation dimensions and this impact dimension, and how you might embed some of that into the work of your own collaborative. But if you wouldn't mind, I love hearing from you about how you might take some of the things that we talked about today and are thinking about using them in some way to advance the work of your collaborative. Would love to hear any of that. By way of wrapping up, and I can follow up with, in addition to including the outcome diary tool, I've done a case study of another data walk that I did that was not virtual, but I can share that And I can also include links to the 3-part guide that FSG published on evaluating collective impact efforts, because sometimes I think looking at some of those measures in the 3rd guide might give you some insights and ideas, regardless of where you are on the journey, how you can be tracking your progress over time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you for everybody joining us this morning. And like Sylvia mentioned, we have not this coming week, but the week following a deeper dive session to really dig into some of this stuff.
Thanks, everyone. I loved our conversation during this session as well. Really enjoyed it.
Great.
I will also include for you that law, Good Arts Law, because I think it's a good one.
Great.
Have a fabulous rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.
Bye.